this week in our public meeting, we have it a bit special and a bit different. We have an international speaker with us, this is Rebecca McLaughlin, who's come to speak to us on the topic of Is Christianity Bad for Women? So if you're coming along for the first time, just check out this topic, or if it's your first time here, we're really glad you're able to join with us, and we'd love to extend a warm welcome. And regardless of your faith background, we're really glad you're able to join with us. We'd love to invite you to stick around beyond this week. We meet every week at this time, and for the rest of the semester, we'll be looking at the Gospel of John. And as a note, public meetings for the rest of the semester will be in a slightly different location. It'll be in Castle, that should be in a 2-7 which we don't have a slide for, but hopefully you can check out our social media or put in the Connect cards, you'll be putting the link there. And all those Connect cards now, this is just a great way to let us know that you're here, and if you have anything you want to know a bit more about, let us know in the comment box. So I will just give us some time to do that. Rebecca holds a PhD from Cambridge University and has a theology degree from Oakhill Seminary in London. She's the author of a few excellent books, such as Confronting Christianity, which I have copied and I highly recommend if you have not read it, and also Jesus Through the Eyes of Women. And we have the wonderful privilege of hearing from Rebecca today, speaking on the topic, Is Christianity Bad for Women? So I'll hand it over to Rebecca now.
It's so good to be with you. If you only have, one talk's worth of time this week, then you should actually leave the room now and come back this time tomorrow, because my best friend Rachel is going to be speaking about Is Christianity Sex Positive, and she's actually much funnier than I am and has some really good things to say. So I won't be offended if you just storm out now. But if you can stay for me and for her, then think of me like the kind of warm-up act. She's the sort of Taylor Swift, and I'm the pick your slightly less glorious warm-up act. This is my first time ever at Sydney University, but I feel oddly at home here because when I was doing my PhD in Cambridge, almost all my friends were Australians and they were from here. And they used to mercilessly mock my accent, would you believe it? And I came to visit some of them here, and they particularly found the way that I said darling funny, and the way that I said dance funny. So they'd be like, "You have a chance to dance in Darling Harbour, darling." They were just mocking me continually. So I feel on the one hand kind of at home here, and on the other hand, if you ruthlessly heckle me and mock me, then I feel even more at home. One of my Australian friends from Sydney University back in Cambridge days was a woman called Sarah Irving at the time. She had grown up in Sydney. She came to Sydney University to study history. She was incredibly smart. She actually won the University Medal for History, and she went on to get a Commonwealth scholarship to go and do a PhD at Cambridge. If that wasn't enough, she's extremely nice and ridiculously pretty. So just imagine the person who you would hate, except that they're too nice, so you have to like them, even though you probably should hate them for having all the things. And when she came to Cambridge in the UK, she was actually at my husband's college. They were good friends, and she was dating a friend of mine who was also from the University of Sydney. Like I say, I could not get away from the Australians. It's like there was a sort of mass deportation of Australians, and then some of them came back, including Sarah. And when I knew Sarah in Cambridge, she was a convinced atheist. She'd been raised in a very loving, secular home. Her dad is also a history academic, extremely intelligent. And when she came to Cambridge University, she was a convinced atheist. She then, after her PhD, she went to Oxford to do some postgraduate work there. And she was a convinced atheist when she showed up at Oxford. And while she was there doing her postdoc, she was very excited because there's going to be a series of lectures by the Australian philosopher Peter Singer. Has anybody heard of Peter Singer? Yeah. So, oh, good. You guys, you're all keeping up with your man, Peter Singer. Peter Singer is a philosopher and an atheist. And he is one of the atheist philosophers who doesn't just kind of trade on Christian ethics to develop his philosophy, but takes very seriously the fact that if you're an atheist, if you don't believe in God at all, then you actually sort of have to figure things out from the grounds up ethically. And according to Peter Singer, instead of valuing all humans as equal because they are human, he proposes that instead we evaluate beings, whether human or animal, according to their capacities. For example, their capacity for suffering, their capacity for self-awareness, etc. And by Peter Singer's calculation, a human infant is actually less morally valuable than an adult pig. Now, when my friend Sarah heard these lectures, she experienced what she later described as sort of intellectual vertigo, because it was the start for her of realizing that her atheism, instead of sort of grounding her deepest moral beliefs, actually kind of stuck a knife in the back. But my guess is that all of us here today, regardless of what we think about God or Jesus or any such thing, that all of us hold certain sort of moral beliefs in common, like the idea that all human beings are fundamentally equal, like the fact that men and women are fundamentally equal, like the fact that the strong and the rich and the powerful don't have the right to trample on the weak and the poor and the marginalised, like the fact that the people starving in the slums in Calcutta have a legitimate sort of moral demands on us here now, that we should in fact be generous and caring towards those in need, like the fact that there should be love across racial difference instead of hostility, like the fact that women shouldn't be coerced into sex. We tend to think of these things, regardless of our religious or philosophical background, as just like basic moral common sense, right? And not something you'd need any particular religion or philosophy to ground. But when Sarah heard those lectures, and then as she started to sort of read and think following that, she realized, oh no, actually, these seemingly self-evident moral truths turn out to be specifically Christian beliefs. And she ended up, honestly, much to my surprise and much to my husband's surprise, she ended up becoming a follower of Jesus. We actually, when we arrived here a few days ago, last week, went to stay with Sarah and her husband and their kids. And for the first time, we sort of saw her in the flesh as somebody who is now a very serious follower of Jesus, having previously been, as I said, a very delightful, kind, highly intelligent, sort of polite atheist. And one of the areas that had made Sarah honestly not even curious about Christianity when she was at your exact age and stage at Sydney University was this idea that Christianity was probably bad for women. That there was sort of history of misogyny, that there was a sense that some of the things that had been really good for women in the last century, the ways in which women have been given greater liberation and opportunities for progress, that Christianity was maybe against those things. And I can very much understand that perspective. But it turns out that if you look more closely at the things that, at least some of the things that have been supposed to be really good for women in terms of how Western society has developed in the last decades, some of them genuinely are good for women, and some of them actually, it turns out, are not. And when I say that, I'm actually not first and foremost talking from a kind of Christian moral perspective, but purely from a kind of psychological perspective, if you look at people's self-reported happiness. So the sexual revolution, in particular, the sexual revolution of the 1960s, was very much sold to us in the West as the liberation of women, right? for centuries, men had been finding ways to sneak around marriage and have commitment-free sex. And great news, now, thanks to the pill, women could as well. But if you look at women's self-reported happiness in the time between then and now in the West, despite other advances and opportunities that women have had in very positive ways, women's self-reported happiness has actually declined. Why is that? One of the reasons is actually that commitment-free sex is not a gift, but it's a poison chalice. Now, I realize this sort of very countercultural claim to make. And again, I'm actually not first and foremost here making it from a Christian perspective, but simply from this perspective of looking at the psychological data. It turns out that for both men and for women, but actually for women in particular, having multiple sexual partners, having commitment-free sex versus getting married and having a commitment to one particular person is correlated with multiple negative mental health outcomes. An increased likelihood of depression and suicidal ideation and alcoholism and drug abuse and many of the things that we wouldn't want to be true for any of us. So it's very strange, like I say, when I was going through sort of at the stage that you were at, it was very much the assumption among my peers that liberating women sexually and kind of creating a culture in which sex was seen as something that should be very much experimented with, and marriage was maybe something to look into one day far into the future, but certainly make sure you explore as much as possible now, sort of figure out what your tastes and otherwise are. That was very much sold to me as well as what would bring fulfillment and happiness. Turns out, as I said, the data says precisely the opposite. Likewise, when we think of things like regular church attendance, I think in a lot of people's minds, going to church and being sort of seriously engaged in religious community would seem like something that's, if anything, psychologically bad for you. You hear all these messages about how you're maybe a sinner, you're somebody who's rebelled against God. It feels like a maybe psychologically harmful message for somebody to hear. And you're expected to live in a certain way. In some ways, your freedom is actually kind of constrained if you're a follower of Jesus. And in many people's minds, you would think, well, that's probably also correlated with just being less happy and fulfilled, less of a thriving human being. But it's fascinating that there's a lot of data that has come out of the Harvard School of Public Health, which is just down the street from where I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the US, to show that actually going to church every week is one of the very best things you can do for your mental health and happiness. And what's even more interesting is it actually seems to have a disproportionately positive effect for women. Conversely, not being engaged in any kind of religious community is correlated with a lot of really negative mental health outcomes. So one of the studies that people have done is on the levels of suicide among people who go to church every week versus folks who don't participate in any kind of religious community. And I had to bring such a sort of a sad and painful topic up on a Tuesday lunchtime. Is it Tuesday? Yeah, it's Tuesday. Okay, I'm very jet lagged still. But it turns out women who go to church once a week or more are 5 times less likely to kill themselves than women who never go. If you look at self-reported happiness, you might enjoy this even if you're not interested in Christianity at all, but you're interested in Australia being better than the US. I'm going to quote you a couple of statistics here. So in Australia, it turns out that 45% of people, so this is a differentiator between men and women, 45% of people who go to church every week report that they are very happy, versus only 33% of people who aren't involved in any religious community. In the US, it's 36% of people who go to church every week who report that they're very happy, versus only 25% who don't go to church at all who report that they're very happy. So, if you want to be extra happy, then 1, be Australian, and 2, go to church every week. Both seem to have a pretty meaningful effect. I think it might be something to do with the sun. I don't know, just speculating. Or just the beautiful, this is a really beautiful city, I have to say. I feel very unpatriotic, but I think Sydney might be a better city than London. But please don't tell anybody else. And it's fascinating, actually, if you look at the history of Christianity, and if you look around the world today, globally, you'll find that Christianity has disproportionately drawn women from the very first, which again, I think is maybe surprising for folks who might think of Christianity as sort of being misogynistic or anti-women. There was a 2nd century Greek philosopher called Celsus who mocked Christianity. He thought Christianity was ridiculous. And one of the reasons was because it seemed to draw so many women. He said Christians want and are able to convince only the foolish and uneducated, only women, slaves, and little children. And at that time, in the ancient world, the fact that something was appealing to women was absolutely to be mocked. In the ancient world, it was not at all seen as a self-evident truth that men and women were fundamentally equal in value. In fact, quite the reverse. It was pretty obvious that men were more important than women were. The men were more intelligent than men. There were so many ways in which men were to be preferred over women. That would have been the basic kind of moral common sense for them at the time. And the thing that actually really disrupted that and has brought us to the point today when, as I say, regardless of how you identify religiously, my guess is you believe that men and women are fundamentally equal. What happened was the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Jesus Through the Eyes of Women, and what I did in that book was I looked through the 4 gospel accounts of Jesus' life in the Bible, the so-called gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you might think, oh, well, those gospels are all named after men. They are. It seems like they were written by these dudes. But actually, if you look at the stories that they're telling, and at the encounters that Jesus had with women, you'll find example after example of times when Jesus actually radically undermines the expectations of his day when it comes to women. One of my favourite examples is in John's Gospel in chapter 4, when Jesus has his longest recorded private conversation with somebody who's not only a woman, which was would have been weird for him as a Jewish male rabbi to be spending time in private talking to this woman. She also came from the hated racial and religious group from a Jewish perspective. She was a Samaritan. So she's from the people group who the Jews of Jesus' day were raised to hate. And it turns out in the course of their conversation, Jesus already knows she's had 5 husbands and she's now living with a man who's not her husband. So she's, in cultural terms, she is somebody who Jesus should not have been seen dead with. And yet, he has with her his longest theological conversation. And he offers her living water. And then she immediately runs to tell everybody she knows about him. And this is a pattern that you see in the Gospels, and it's a pattern that you see sort of in the early Christian movement, of women encountering Jesus and then running to tell other people about him. Another one of my favourite stories, again in John's Gospel, is of a time when 2 of Jesus' friends, female friends, who are called Mary and Martha of Bethany, they sent Jesus a message because their beloved brother Lazarus is very sick. Now, interestingly, and this is true actually of a lot of women in the Gospels, we don't know if Mary or Martha are married. We don't know if they have children. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. It seems like the Gospel authors don't have much interest in those things, which often, as we look back over history, you think, oh, women always defined by were they married, did they have children, that kind of thing. Actually, often in the Gospels, like I say, it seems like those details are not even important to the story. So Mary and Martha send Jesus a message saying, Lord, the one you love is sick, talking about their brother Lazarus. And John then makes very clear, he says, Jesus loved Mary and Martha and their brother. And so he didn't come. You know, I think, well, that doesn't make any sense. You know, it would make sense if it said, Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, so he dropped everything and came at once. Or, Jesus didn't really care about these women, and so he had other things going on that he thought he'd prioritize, so he didn't come. But instead, John tells us that Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and so he deliberately waited until Lazarus was dead. And then he came. And Martha runs out to meet him. And she says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, he will give you. This extraordinary faith this woman has. Jesus, a great healer, she believes that even though her brother is dead, that maybe he can do something. Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. There was a common belief among Jews of Jesus' day that one day at the end of time that God would raise his people from the dead. But that wasn't why Mary and Martha had called for Jesus. They wanted him to do something now. So she says to Jesus, you can almost sort of sense her disappointment in the text. Yes, Lord, I know he will rise again at the resurrection on the last day. You can kind of imagine her thinking, well, what about now, Jesus? And what about now? And then Jesus looks into this grieving woman's eyes and he says some of his most famous and profound words that have sort of echoed down the last 2,000 years. He says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, will live, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? So he's saying these are some of Jesus' most crazy, transformational, and famous words. And he says them to one particular Jewish woman whom he loves. And he asks her, do you believe this? Here's the thing, if you read through any of the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, you'll find that time and again, he is engaging in a very personal way with the women he encounters. He engages with women who are ostracized and marginalized, like that Samaritan woman who had 5 husbands and was living with a man who was no longer not her husband. He engages with women who are very sick, like a woman who'd had sort of menstrual bleeding for 12 years and had spent all her money on doctors and they'd made her worse and not better. And she thinks to herself, if only I could touch the hem of Jesus' garment, I could be made well. He engages with women who just come to him in desperation one way or another, like Mary and Martha calling for him because their brother was dying. And he has these transformational conversations with them. And then it's fascinating, toward the end of the Gospels, and this is one of the things, if you've ever read the 4 Gospel accounts of Jesus' life, you'll find that they all tell us sort of slightly different stories about Jesus. It's not surprising because actually the Gospels are very short. Even the longest one, Luke's Gospel, you could read in 2.5 hours of time. Watch a long film or movie, and that's sort of equivalent length of time to reading Luke's Gospel. So the Gospel authors are trying to cram into this very small space the most important stories from their perspective about Jesus. And all of the Gospel authors spend significant time telling us about the very end of Jesus' life on earth. Telling us about when Jesus was, in fact, crucified by the Roman Empire. He was buried, and then it's claimed that he was actually raised from the dead on the 3rd day. But what's really striking about the gospel accounts of this is that each gospel author points us to the eyewitness testimony of women for these events. And why is that strange or striking? Like to us, we wouldn't think of the testimony of a woman any differently than the testimony of a man. If anything, if we think back to the Me Too movement, the concept that we should believe women, if anything, we might, in certain circumstances, be more willing to trust what a woman had said in a situation than a man. But in the world and culture into which these first Gospels were written, the testimony of women was not seen as credible at all. In fact, women were seen as over-emotional and especially untrustworthy when it came to religious questions. And yet in all the 4 Gospel accounts of Jesus' life, it's the women who are the first witnesses of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And honestly, that's the last thing that you would have planned. If you were setting out 2,000 years ago to write a compelling story, to convince people that something really crazy, like somebody rising from the dead, had happened, the last thing you would have done is to say, oh well, some women saw it. And I love how in John's Gospel in particular, John emphasizes the fact that the women who saw Jesus' resurrection were weeping. Sort of playing into the paradigm of like women being very emotional, that they really loved Jesus. And his first followers, both men and women, had been absolutely devastated when Jesus had been crucified by the Romans. Despite the fact he'd actually told them again and again this was going to happen, they were completely devastated. And it was early on the morning of the third day after this happened that the women had gone to Jesus' tomb to try and sort of complete his burial preparations. It had to be a kind of rush job done when he was first crucified because the Jewish Sabbath was coming. So they'd gone early on that third day with the expectation that they would get to sort of tend Jesus' corpse. And instead, they find the tomb is empty. And they actually get to meet with the resurrected Jesus himself. I love the fact that one of the sort of women who's central to this whole story is Mary Magdalene. She's gone on to become one of probably Jesus' most famous female disciple. We know very few things about her background. We know that she came from a town called Magdala, because Mary was the most common name for women of Jesus' time and place. So, Mary Magdala was kind of her way of distinguishing her from all the other Marys, like Jesus' mother Mary, and like Mary and Martha I just mentioned. You cannot swing a cat in the Gospels without hitting a Mary. And so she is gone to Jesus' tomb, and Jesus sort of comes to her, appears to her, and she thinks at first that he's the gardener. And she says, can you tell me where they've taken my Lord? I think that she thinks maybe Jesus' body has been sort of removed and taken somewhere else, and she wants to go there. And Jesus just says to her very boring, most common name, Mary. And suddenly she recognizes him for who he is. We see this, these incredibly sort of tender and personal relationships Jesus had with women. We see time and again in the Gospels, especially in Luke's Gospel, how Jesus often defends women when they're under attack from often kind of self-righteous men. And we see, if we look back at kind of the history of ideas, that the very idea that men and women are fundamentally equal has actually come to us from the radical life and teachings of this first century Jewish man known as Jesus of Nazareth. But here's the thing with Jesus of Nazareth. Probably all of us in this room, regardless of how we identify religiously, would be like, oh, well, good on you. Great that Jesus had some sort of moral foresight to validate women in a way that they weren't being validated in the ancient world. We probably all, if we know anything about Jesus, we probably have a generally positive view of Jesus. Most people don't think of Jesus as a morally terrible person. He's known for some really great teachings like love your neighbor as yourself. Even, atheists like Richard Dawkins think that Jesus is kind of a good guy. So is that where we can leave things when it comes to Jesus? I'm afraid not. Because the claims that Jesus made about himself and about us are outrageous and offensive. How are they outrageous? Well, like I said, Jesus looked into Martha's eyes and told her that he was the resurrection and the life. And that whether you were dead or alive actually was in the noise. What mattered was whether you were trusting in him. Jesus' ethical teaching, if you read the Gospels carefully, you'll find it's actually profoundly offensive as well. He talks as if the God who made each one of us actually is also rightfully the judge of all of us. And that all of us completely failed the sort of moral test. In fact, he talks as if we are deeply sinful and that we don't just need a kind of great moral example or a life coach or a guru. We actually need a saviour. And he presents himself as the one who died on a Roman cross in order that you and I might live if we would put our trust in him. Those are radical claims. Those are frankly offensive claims. But if you, like me, and like my friend Sarah, who I mentioned earlier, are somebody who's perhaps at the deepest part of you, your most fundamental longing is to be extravagantly loved, then whether you are male or female here today, the one person who has proved his utter, extravagant, outrageous, life-giving love for you is the man who died upon a cross 2,000 years ago. My timer tells me that I'm 2 minutes and 30 seconds over the time I was meant to speak, so forgive me for that. I would love to hear whatever questions you guys might have in the rest of our time. I don't know if there's going to be are people just going to stand up and shout out? Okay. Feel free to stand up and shout out. Also, I'm not easily offended, so if you have a question for me, if you want to say everything you said was stupid or whatever, like, go ahead. I'm like, don't feel you need to filter your questions for the sake of my tender feelings. I'd love to just hear honestly what's on your mind. Gentleman in the back.
How do you square the claim that men and women are fundamentally equal with the other claims about the gospel that men should be the head of their wives?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's actually not in the Gospels. It's in Paul's. So for those who are not familiar with the Bible, this guy called the Apostle Paul, who was sent by Jesus specifically to tell people who were not Jewish about Jesus. And he wrote a bunch of letters that are now in the New Testament. And one of them was a letter to a church in Ephesus. And in the 5th chapter of that letter, Paul speaks specifically about what Christian marriage is. And in order to understand what he's saying there, we actually have to do a little bit of sort of dial back into the Old Testament scriptures and into the Gospels to understand what's going on there. So in the Old Testament, you have this repeated metaphor of God as a loving, faithful husband, and Israel as this often unfaithful wife. But this marriage is in crisis because God's people are always sort of cheating on him with other so-called gods. And so when Jesus steps onto the stage of human history, one of the weird things he says about himself is he says that he is the bridegroom. Now it's a weird thing to say because Jesus actually never got married in the course of his life on earth. So why is he claiming to be the bridegroom? Well, it's actually because he's stepping into the shoes of the creator God of the Old Testament. And then, so Paul is picking up on this in Ephesians chapter 5. And he says 2 very offensive things. I'm going to say the first one first, and the first one will hit us today as offensive. It's the second one actually that would have hit the first readers of the letter as most offensive. So first he says this. He says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church." Now, when I was your age, I was first grappling with this text, and I thought, wow, that's like, I don't like that. You know, Jesus, as I mentioned, if you read through the Gospels, Jesus is always lifting women up, and it seems like Paul here is pushing women down. Wives, submit to your husbands. The husband's head, the wife is Christ's head of the church. Like, what is that about? I went to very kind of academic, all-girls high school, went to university, very much... feminist in all the good ways, I hope. And this text is like sort of jarring. But then Paul goes on, he says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." So just think about that for a second. How did Christ or Jesus love the church and give himself up for her? That's Jesus dying on the cross. And what Paul is saying in Ephesians 5 is that actually the purpose of Christian marriage is not for a man and a woman to make each other very happy. It's actually not even primarily to have children, which like having children is great. I have 3 children, recommend, it's all good. Well, it's also really hard, but anyway, that's another thing. From a Christian perspective, and this is weird, the point of marriage is actually to be like a little scale model of Jesus' love for his people. Now, sometimes that text that you flagged there gets really poorly taught by Christians. And people will say, well, for Christians, wives are to submit to their husbands because women are sort of naturally more submissive than men, or like men are naturally better leaders than women. I'm like, honestly, that's not my experience. Like I was raised to be a leader, and I have a very privileged background, whatever. Paul is not saying this is because of psychological differences between men and women or because of anything else. What he's saying is This is because of Jesus and the church. And so the actual point, as I say, of God even in the first place creating men and women, creating sex and creating marriage, was actually to give us a little picture of how much Jesus loves us. And the love that Jesus has for his people is not the kind of love that kind of lords it over somebody or oppresses them or sort of squashes them down. It's actually the love that goes to the cross and dies for them. Sorry, it was a long answer, but it was an important question.
Thank you very much.
Yes?
You said that Mary Magdalene was one of Jesus' most popular female followers.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, like all of his 12 disciples were men. Why wasn't Mary Magdalene considered one of his disciples?
That's a great question. So yeah, famously, Jesus had 12, there's something called the 12 disciples. Actually, they could be called the 12 apostles, sort of sent ones. And all of them are Jewish, and all of them are men. But now we know that Christianity isn't just for Jewish men, it's actually for like everybody, regardless of whether you're male or female, regardless of your kind of ethnic background. So why would Jesus pick 12 Jewish men for this very specific task? Well, actually, again, if you look back at the Old Testament, you'll see there are 12 tribes of Israel, each sort of starting with a Jewish dude. And so Jesus is kind of relaunching God's people, sort of symbolically relaunching God's people when he chooses these 12 Jewish men. But actually, if you read Luke's Gospel in particular, I name my son Luke because I love Luke's Gospel. Luke's Gospel in particular makes it clear that there were many women among Jesus' disciples, in the fullest sense, who travelled around with him, who learned his sayings, who watched what he did. One of them was Mary Magdalene. If you read beginning of Luke chapter 8, you hear about 3 women in particular. And it's significant because in Jewish legal context, having 3 witnesses is always the best. So when you see 3 names given, that's because we're sort of trying to think of like, oh, this is testimony that we're looking for here. So that the 3 women who Luke highlights as giving accurate testimony about Jesus' ministry are number 1, Mary Magdalene, number 2, a woman called Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's household manager, who would have been a very kind of high status woman who had left King Herod's court in order to traipse around the countryside with Jesus and his other disciples, and a woman called Susanna. So we have these 3 women pointed to as people whose eyewitness testimony is being recorded in Luke's Gospel. And then, as I mentioned, we have at the end, Jesus' very specific choice to reveal himself first to his female disciples. And why do I say it's a very specific choice? Well, actually, in John's Gospel, the women go to the tomb, and they find that it's empty, and they sort of run back to the other disciples, including the male apostles, and they say, like, we just found the empty tomb, and at least two of Jesus' male disciples, Peter, one of his closest buddies, and the author of John's Gospel, kind of run to Jesus' tomb to see what's happening. And they see the tomb is empty, but they don't meet with Jesus. And then Jesus meets with Mary and some of the other women. So I think we need to not get kind of totally like thrown off course by the fact that Jesus chose 12 male Jewish apostles. It's actually he chose, like I say, a whole group of women who travelled around with him as well, and who were then and now are today, actually, as I said, women are disproportionately represented in the church around the world, and most of the sharing of the good news of Jesus that is done today is done by women in kind of one-on-one and small group situations. Gentleman back there.
You talked about gender roles within like marriage. What about gender roles within like a church? So like them not being able to preach in person, like Sydney Anglican churches, stuff like that.
Yeah, so no, that's a good and important question. And actually, theologians I respect would take a range of views on exactly what roles women should and shouldn't be playing in churches. But there are 2 things that it's important for us to recognise as we kind of even enter into these conversations. Number 1, and this is something, if you read through the Gospels, there are certain things that Jesus has to say again and again and again to his disciples because they're dumb and they don't get it. And one of them is, in his kingdom, that actually leadership is not about power and privilege, it's about service and sacrifice. He continually has to tell them that the last will be first and the first will be last. In fact, he says, one time he's explained to them, because they just haven't got it, he says, listen, even the Son of Man, that's one of his favourite ways of referring to himself, didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, in our minds, because we're actually a little bit like the disciples, when we think about a kind of organizational structure in a church, we think, well, of course, the pastor is the most important person, right? You know, the highest status person. Everyone else can kind of look up to the pastor because the pastor's like top of the tree, right? That's sort of our natural human assumption. Even in a university setting, you have like the university president, and then you have the provost and whatever. Like, we're sort of used to these hierarchies and thinking actually the person at the top is the most important person. But Jesus says in his kingdom it's the other way around. So we need to get out of the mindset of thinking that being a Christian pastor is about power and privilege, and instead recognizing that it's about service and sacrifice. And I think one of the cultural ways in which some brothers and sisters in Christ who live in other parts of the world where Christianity might be actually quite heavily persecuted is that whereas in our sort of cultural Western culture, we can again think, oh, you know, being pastor of the church, well, that's a great gig. You know, everybody looks up to you, isn't that fantastic? Actually, in the first churches that were being formed in the first century, and in many churches around the world today, the pastor is the first person who's going to be hauled off to prison. The pastor is the first person who's going to be executed for their faith in Jesus. And just as in marriage, husbands are called to like sacrifice themselves for their wives, wives are not called to sacrifice themselves for their husbands. So actually, in the church, the pastor has like a pretty specific role of being ready to serve and sacrifice for the people that he's trying to lead. Yes?
Hi, could you clarify what you mean by men and women are equal? Are you saying men and women are the same, or are you saying, or perhaps there are special differences that make each gender what they are?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so when I say men and women are equal, I'm not saying men and women are the same. And the way in which men and women are not the same is our biological difference. Now, people often, in the past and sometimes sort of in Christian conversation, want to talk about the sort of psychological differences between men and women. And so, for example, say, well, you know, maybe men are more aggressive than women, or women are more nurturing than men, or whatever it is. And if you study large groups of men and women, you will likely find that on average, the average man is more aggressive than the average woman, for instance. I know that's kind of negative characteristic. Sorry guys, I didn't mean to pick like a nasty one. But you can find average differences in psychology between, you know, most men and most women. Just like you say, you know, men are taller than women. And if I called up every man in this room one by one, my guess is like most of you are taller than me, but some of you are not. So it's like a spectrum. It's not like innate to being male that you are tall. Like, it's not that every man is taller than every woman, right? It's that on average men are taller than women. And I think to me that's actually the most helpful way to think about sort of psychological differences between men and women, because there are many ways in which I actually kind of conform more to some, you know, male stereotypes when it comes to like the ways that I think and psychologize. Not all, but like some. My husband likewise. Sort of between us, we make like one stereotypical man and woman, but the characteristics are kind of distributed pretty freely, you know. And that's fine. So when I'm saying that men and women are equal, what I mean is they're equal in value. It's from the very, very beginning of the Bible. In the first chapter of Genesis, when God makes human beings, he makes them in his image, male and female. And it's a fundamental building block of the Christian understanding of humanity, that both men and women are equally in the image of God. Though, as I mentioned, there are certain contexts in which men and women are called, from a Christian perspective, into different roles, but both absolutely equal in dignity and value and purpose. We have 4 minutes and 48 seconds left, so hit me up. Yes?
Given we know that men and women are equal from creation, that we're both made in the image of God, why then, when Jesus came, was the Jewish perspective that men were better or more equal? Or is that just how?
Sorry, swigging my water there. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, honestly, with some of the Jewish leaders of his time. It's complicated because almost all of the first Christians were Jewish, right? So this is, from the very beginning, it's kind of a within Judaism conversation that's going on. But then one of the big questions actually in the early church was, do non-Jews, do Gentiles have to become Jewish in order to become Christian? And the answer was very clearly no, but let's sort of figure that out a bit. So it's sort of a within Judaism conversation. And often when Jesus is having sort of theological debates with some of the Jewish leaders of his time, he's basically telling them that they're wrong. So again, one of the most fundamental pieces of Christian teaching and doctrine is that we humans are actually very sinful, and that we will, given half the opportunity, we will actually take power and privilege and we will squash other people down. It's interesting, if you read through the Old Testament scriptures, you'll find 3 categories of people who are particularly highlighted by God as like important to be cared for because they're specifically vulnerable, and they are widows, orphans, and immigrants, essentially, sojourners. So we see a particular concern that God has, especially for women in a sort of vulnerable situation throughout the Old Testament. And so, yeah, if the ways in which certain Jewish leaders at the time were dismissive of women would have been against God's will. But the Jews were living as an oppressed people in the Greco-Roman Empire. And from a Greek and Roman man's perspective, women were evidently inferior and often actually victims of what we would now see as like sexual violence. But actually, even our idea, our concept, and praise God for this, for the fact that we believe this, the fact that we believe today that women should have to consent to sex, that was not the assumption in the Greco-Roman Empire at all. Yes, right in the back. Great question. Why was Jesus why was Jesus born as a man and not a woman? Is that fair? Yeah. So again, if we go back to the beginning, and that's what the Bible sort of invites us to do time and again, go back to like, okay, what's happening at the very beginning? And God making male and female both in his image. And then, as I say, there's this picture that comes time and again of God as a loving husband and Israel as the wife whom he loves. And so Jesus being born as a man rather than a woman is actually because that picture is going to be like God's made us male and female and given us the sort of picture of marriage as a way of communicating his love for us and his relationship with us. So it's not, God didn't become flesh as a man because men are superior to women, but because he's trying to tell us a very particular story. And it's interesting in the language that we have describing what eternity is going to be like. And for Christians, actually our life here and now is very brief. If you're a follower of Jesus, you need to have your eyes fixed on eternity. And in eternity, if you're a follower of Jesus, you are part of Jesus' bride. Whether you're a man or a woman, like, sorry guys, if you're a Christian, you're like actually part of Christ's bride. Women in meaningful senses are sons of God, so it's all very confusing. But yeah, it's about giving us this picture of how much he loves us. Yes?
What are some ways that sexism might pervade the church today that aren't actually God's design differences between men and women?
Yeah, great question. So what are some ways in which sexism might be common in the church today that aren't part of God's design? I think one of the ways is in the assumption that people sometimes make that women are sort of theologically inferior to men, not in terms of, I think there are I certainly don't know any Christian man who would think that women are sort of lesser in value than men from a Christian perspective. I mean, that's like such obvious rank heresy that maybe those people exist, I don't know them at all. But I think sometimes there's been this idea that maybe women are sort of less deeply interested in theology than men are. And so, if you're going to have an event for women at your church, then, make sure it's kind of around crafting and motherhood or something, and not around like deep theological debates, right? But again, if you look at the Gospels, Jesus has some of his most theologically rich conversations with women. He doesn't seem to have that approach at all. So I think that would be one example. Yes.
I think you made a
Oh, sorry, we're minus 48 seconds. Does that mean... I would love to attempt to answer anybody else's questions privately. I'm having fun here, so I could just keep yapping. You guys have lectures to go to. So I will shut up now, but please come and chat with me afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm going to invite Jenny up, she's going to close us out as well.
Thank you, Rebecca, for the talk. I was encouraged that these results all with men, women, and that you shared that up with that inspiration. I'm going to lead us in time of prayer now. We pray in response to what we've heard. As Christians, prayer is something is how we communicate with God, and it's an important part of our relationship with Him. We believe that when we pray, God listens to us, and we can speak to Him about things on our hearts. Let's pray together. Our Father, we come to you, the God of the universe, creator God, and at the same time our Father. What a joy it is that we can speak to you. You are the one who set the world in motion. We know that